Welcome to this video on research questions. It's a follow-on from a lot of work we've been doing around qualitative methodologies, and it's an opportunity really for you to start to think about what your research is likely to be and how it will work. So the first thing, I'd like you just to spend a few minutes thinking by yourself what you think a research question is. So perhaps pause the video in a second. I want you to think about what its role is based upon what you know up till this point, how you think you might frame it, what its role is within the research. So please just take a minute and have a think about what you believe this to be. Okay. Hopefully you stopped the video and you took a few minutes just to think about what a research question is. What we're going to do now is actually go through different facets of research questions and how you might use them. So the first thing we want to do probably is to start to define what an actual research question is. So probably a good way of thinking about it is that you're going to have a topic area, and imagine that that's a field, it's an open space. So perhaps you're looking at motivation, perhaps you're looking at practice routines of students, or perhaps you're thinking about, in a classroom situation, the interaction between students and how that affects learning. So that would be your topic area. It's a bit like a field. If you imagine that, then building a house is kind of a research question. It's the specific bounded area that serves a purpose for you in that topic area. So from a general I'm interested in, we're going to move to something that's very specific, e.g. I'm interested in sight reading, and then that might take you towards a question, something like, what sight reading approaches do teachers find most effective with their students? And then you might even want to further refine that, start putting windows and a door into your house, as it were, and really bounding that research into a question like, what sight reading approaches do piano teachers find most effective to use with beginners, let's say grades 1 to 3? So we see we're going from something very broad, a topic area, and we're getting more and more specific. Okay, so part of defining a good question, we need to sort of ask ourselves, so what? Why are we going to actually do this research in the first place? It has to be something that has value. If you're the only person interested in this question, there might not be a lot of reason to actually do the research. So ask yourself, why are you doing it? And there are a few different ways that you can frame this. The first one's likely to be gap filling. So you've read some related papers and you realize that there's a gap in the research, something that's not known. Very often academic papers will end with something like further research is required around this area. And it's a really good way of actually starting to build your research. Go to some papers in the topic area you're interested in. Look at the there needs to be further research comments, and then actually decide you're going to frame your research around that gap, around that thing that's been identified by others. Another way of doing this is to think about an area that's neglected. So you're going to find an area that very few people are discussing, or an area that's frequently overlooked. The problem here might be that it's overlooked and it's neglected because people generally don't care about it. But if you find something that you think people would care about, but it's neglected, that might be a great area for you to research. There's the possibility of you formulating a new formulation of an existing idea. So this could be that you've noticed that most of the research around a particular area uses surveys, let's say, and perhaps you might use narrative inquiry. So you're going to use a different methodology or ask a slightly different question, a new formulation that perhaps will provide revealing new insights. It might reveal something new to people. So that's an idea of a new formulation. And finally, you might come up with something that's a completely new idea. It's not that it's neglected, it's just that nobody has thought of it yet. This arguably has the highest risk, because even developing a literature review might be challenging if it really is an entirely new area. And there's definitely that question around the so what. If it's a completely new area, it might have been neglected, it might have been left just because people aren't interested. So Potentially it's the richest, you're gonna break new ground, but also potentially it's the most dangerous because perhaps it's new ground because nobody's ever really been interested and the existing data doesn't really help you get a foothold in the area. Let's just think about developing the research question. Your methodology and your question should be interlinked. So the type of question you ask is to some extent going to define your methodology. As you'll have noticed from the previous videos we've done around different methodologies, you'll note that that's the case. You have to frame your research in a particular way. So there are different kinds of questions and they're going to lead to different types of methodology. So for instance, perhaps you've got a descriptive question. So what's happening in this context? And that's going to lead you to things like ethnographies, case studies, or surveys. Perhaps you're trying to explain why something happened. So that might lead you to a case study. But remember, this is not a historical thing. It's going to be a contemporary phenomenon. Perhaps it's a phenomenology or a narrative inquiry if we're going to do this explanatory type work. Something predictive. So you're looking for a causal relationship. When I do this, what will be the outcome for my students? What will happen next? That's going to be a kind of experimentation or a causation study. These typically tend to be quantitative and perhaps not so frequent, particularly not in music education research at master's level. Perhaps you're going to do something that's evaluative. So what should happen? So this is more like policy research or participatory research. And finally, perhaps you might want to do something that's transformative or critical. So you're looking to change something. So that would be something more like an action research, perhaps critical ethnography or participant research again. When we're framing our research, particularly if we're using qualitative research questions, we need to keep them open-ended. Occasionally, you might start with a hypothesis. So you're going to start with, based on the research, I think this is what happens. And then you build your research to either prove or disprove that. However, more often, we're going to be using an inductive approach. That means that you're going to be developing findings through your research as you analyze your data. So it's going to be needing to be open-ended. It's non-directional. We want to begin with questions like a what or a how, and they converge and they convey an emerging design. You'll notice that in that second bullet point, it is just a what or a how. However, it's important to note that Yin suggests that there could also be a why. We can use why questions in case study. Creswell says that actually we shouldn't use whys. He suggests that when we use a why, we're suggesting causation, and he doesn't believe that qualitative data, this interpretivist approach, leads to the kind of why, leads to that suggestion of causation. However, Yin says that it can. So just be aware there's debate in the literature around whether qualitative data should be, or questions should be in the form of what or how, or if we can include why there. You're going to want to use some exploratory verbs. So things like discover, seek, understand, explore, describe. These are words which we want to use in our questions. And we need to be sure that we're focusing on a single phenomena or a concept. So try to avoid having questions which are essentially double questions, where you're going to be looking at two phenomena. Let's say motivation, but also parental impact on practice. Let's say it's that. Having those double phenomenons, both the parents and the motivation, is problematic. Try to focus on a single one of those. Research questions have some essential qualities. I would suggest that your question is likely to be a single sentence, at most probably two, but you really want to keep it as brief as possible. You want to make sure your scope is focused. It's not too narrow, but equally broad is probably more dangerous. So we want to focus that scope around a particular age group, a particular context, a particular phenomenon. We want to make sure that our work is going to be manageable and answerable. So Don't give yourself something that you can't answer within the time frame of your research. You're going to have about 6 months to do this. If you ask a huge question, it's not practical to do. So keep it bounded. Bounded is a word that's used a lot here. Keep it bounded to make sure that you can answer it. Make sure that the data that you're likely to collect will allow you to answer that question. There needs to be a connection. So don't ask a question that you can't answer with the data you're likely to collect. So if you're looking at the impact of let's say, a qualification across the whole of the UK, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to collect data across the whole of the UK. You wouldn't be able to answer that question. Okay. Cohen and Mannion in that book, they talk about the WH framework, and they think that when you're framing your research questions, you need to think about the 4 WHs: the what, the who, the where, and the when. And this might be a good way of you framing your questions. So a weak question might be something like, how do teachers use technology? It's very broad. A stronger version of that would be something like, how do early career secondary English teachers in urban UK schools integrate digital tools into their classroom practice? We might even say that we're looking at that specifically between 2025 and 2026. You'll see the framing moves from something that's very broad to something that's actually very, very specific, using these what, who, where, and when approaches. Let's have a quick look at some things to avoid some kind of a bad research questions. So this comes from Cohen and Mannion's book, and they highlight several different things to be avoided. So the first thing is 2 questions in one. So when we really should just ask one question in one question, not have 2. So an example might be something like, what are the effects of classroom technology on student engagement? And why do teachers resist adopting new tools? So it appears like it's connected, which it is, but there are 2 very separate questions there, and that type of thing should be avoided. They're probably 2 different pieces of research. False dichotomies. This is where we reduce a question down to an either or type statement. So we might have something like, is standardized testing an accurate measure of student ability, or does it perpetuate educational inequality? So there's some assumptions here. The problems are, it suggests that it must be one or the other, when both or perhaps even neither could be true. So it doesn't allow us to really get to the heart of the issue, to get to the truth, as it were. False assumptions. We've got to avoid placing our assumptions into the question, particularly because that's very often done without evidence. So a question like, why do male students prefer multiple choice tests over essay questions in examinations? So this clearly assumes that male students do prefer multiple choice questions, and it also makes an assumption that all male students prefer multiple choice questions over essay questions, and clearly that's likely to be untrue. So already we've got a problem there with that kind of question. Tautological questions. These are ones where at the heart of the question is a truism. So already we it's problematic to answer that type of question. So for instance, why do so many wealthy students attend elite universities? A problem with a question like this is that elite universities are partially defined by the fact that they recruit wealthy students. So this question boils back down to, why do wealthy students attend universities that recruit wealthy students? Well, it kind of answers itself, so it's not a real question. We need to avoid bias and leading questions. So this is where the framing closes down the question due to a series of assumptions. So for instance, we might have a question like this. How does the obviously outdated music curriculum fail to meet the needs of today's digital native students? So the problem here is that we're assuming that the curriculum is obviously outdated, where it might not be. We're assuming that it fails to meet students' needs, and it also assumes that students now are all digital natives. So in there's a series of problems. The framing is bias, it's a leading question, and it doesn't lead us to quality research. The next one is avoiding kind of binary yes-no type questions. So any question that can be reduced down to a yes or a no, doesn't really allow us to answer it with the rich data that we're going to be collecting, particularly in qualitative research. So something like, do teachers use formative assessment in their classrooms? That's easily answered with either a yes or a no, which doesn't really give us that detailed information that we're looking for. There's also a possibility of combining multiple problems into one question. So some questions have two parts to them. They also have assumptions in them. They could also be tautological all at the same time. So we need to make sure that we're not just looking for one of these in isolation, but we go through each of these things to avoid, and we check them all off when we kind of test our questions. Okay. Another thing that some people want to do is to have one primary question underpinned by a series of sub-questions, and this can work quite well. However, we need to do it with caution. I would suggest that for your research, you only have one primary question. Sometimes you have two on bigger research, but I would suggest for this level, go with one question. Then it might be that to answer that effectively, you have a few sub-questions underneath it, and this is fine. But I would say you want to limit yourself to no more than 5. Very often when I'm supervising people, I tend to say, actually, just let's focus on that single primary question. But I know for some people, they like to have the sub-questions, and that can work well. Very often those sub-questions tend to lead us either towards the type of data that's going to be collected, or a way that we're going to actually analyze the data. So that might be how you use sub-questions if you want to, but very often, just if you've got a core question that's really strong, you might not even need the sub-questions anyway. Anyway, I hope this helps. Hopefully it's going to help you to frame some research questions. What I suggest you do is just sit down now, having gone through these slides and this video, and think about a few different questions you could ask. So just get some practice in of framing questions effectively. Go through the slides, check off for different things, make sure that you're asking the questions in the right way and that you're avoiding all of the things that are problematic, and start to think about how you define really good questions. Anyway, I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.